Bad Brains, Fugazi, Minor Threat, and Scream. In this video, I'm going to show you a clip from my interview with veteran DC punk producer Don Zientara, who worked with all these bands and more. He discusses some of his history with those bands, as well as the history of the DC punk scene, one of the most important punk movements that ever took place. So Don, having worked with Bad Brains, Minor Threat, Scream, Fugazi, you've pretty much worked with every influential band from the DC punk scene. How did your relationship with the DC punk scene begin?
Well, very strangely. I mean, I run into a lot of things just by accident. That's the way it goes. I'm going to start with me in Washington, D.C. here. And I've been playing music, guitar all my life, like 3,000 million other people in the world. And so when you come to a city, you basically look around for fellow musicians to play with and jam with and maybe even start a band and things like that. So that's what I did. And we played some stuff. It was just a not memorable local band, basically. There's a lot of those around. So, but one of our guitarists was sort of forward-looking, and we were basically in the. We're talking the 70s here. You remember the 70s? No, you don't. You don't remember the 70s.
I wasn't there,
don't
man.
lie to me. These are 70s. And this was sort of folk rock type thing, more rock than folk, but who cares? You know, the lines blur. Yeah. So one of our guitarists, I said, was a little more forward looking, and he got into some bands that were actually playing a lot of original music, a lot of alternative music at the time. And this is when disco was taking over. Everybody was thinking, well, maybe the world is going towards drum machines and a lot of synthesizers. So I got a little bit into recording. I had a stereo tape recorder and I had a few microphones, and we recorded when I was playing in the band. We recorded our demo very, very just minimally in a sense. But he knew I had the equipment. He said, well, you know, we're playing at this place. Why don't come and record us? So I did. And on the bill itself, down at this place they were playing at, was a band called the Slicky Boys. And the Slicky Boys were even more tuned into what was happening in the new sort of alternative, surf, psychedelic, call what you want, era. And their manager at the time, manager/agent, was Skip Groff, who owned Yesterday and Today Records in Rockville, who was very tied into the punk scene as it was at the time. Mm-hmm. And this was just emerging, really. So they wanted me to record them since I had the recorder there and everything. And I recorded them. And so we all got together to mix it as it is, one track vocal, one track music. Put it together. And Skip came over and he saw the operation as it was. And he said, hey, I may have some people that would like to record for you. Now, I didn't know at the time, what he was into, what punk was at all or anything like that. But he had known some groups and they were not very well liked at some of the studios in town. I won't go into details, but there was basically, they just weren't taken as serious musicians. Mm-hmm. As were a lot of them at the time. So he said, these guys called the Teen Idols would like to record. And so he brought them over. They recorded. And then he said, hey, there's a band, another band called Bad Brains. They're sort of a black punk band. And, cool. We could, you should record them. And so he and he brought them over. He didn't actually come over himself, but we recorded them. And then it just sort of took off from there. Teen Idols broke up, Minor Threat. And then I got to get to know Ian and the rest of the guys in Minor Threat pretty well. And they brought over all the punk bands that were in the city at the time. And I was just immersed in punk music and got to know punk music very, very well. And that's how it sort of took off. And we really, at the time, it was a perfect confluence of ideas because I had equipment that wasn't the best. It wasn't studio quality, but they knew that they really weren't looking for that. They wanted to be someplace comfortable, and they wanted someplace that could really capture their energy rather than capturing every detail and accuracy and high definition of their sound. So that was just lucky, I guess, serendipitous, whatever you want to call it. And so it just took off from there.
That is so cool. And so you just mentioned Bad Brains and Minor Threat. Those are arguably the two most influential punk bands from the DC scene. In your opinion, this is a subjective question, of course, but which of the two were more influential, if that makes sense even?
I never thought about that. I think they're both influential in their own ways. Remember, I mean, punk was about a lot of things, and it was breaking away from the status quo of the, I guess you can call it California rock sound, but also it joined in with a lot of social issues, and it just joined in with a lot of underground movements in the country, and basically let people know that there's other music other than the mainstream music. And that was, they all had their place in that thing. That's why there were so many different punk bands. They all had something to say, and they all said it, basically.
Yeah, no, I think it was a very important cultural movement for sure. In your opinion, what distinguished the DC punk scene from, say, the punk scene in New York or London?
That's a good one. I don't know. I should have wore a coat too. Geez, you should have told me you're going to dress up.
I'll take it off. There we go. We're even now.
No.
Now we're even. We're good.
I can get a tie too.
Hey, all good, man.
Way it goes. Wow. First of all, they all had their own social issues coming down through there. New York is a natural just because it's got so many people and there's so many different things going on. And I mean, that's why every band that played here eventually played in New York City at one point in time. And I think that Washington was it was a little bit out of the mainstream at the time. And a lot of the punks here didn't like that. But at the same time, it gave them the liberty and the freedom to do what the hell they wanted rather than to be part of a big movement like in New York or in London. I'm not sure what exactly was going on in London. I know a lot of it was anti-governmental. Here, it was you could do songs about anything you wanted, and you could talk about anything you wanted, and it wasn't frowned on to do that. So it was kind of more. It was very freeing in a lot of ways. Remember I guess the New York clubs opened up more to punk first before DC clubs did, and there were no clubs that really wanted punks in there because they thought they would start fights and they'd break things and there'd be a lot of damage. So we don't want punk music in our place, and so they started getting very creative about it, and they started renting out their own places or asking places if they could play at them, like VFW halls and places like anything, skating rinks. You name it, any place that would hold a lot of people. The Wilson Center is very famous for that. Their basement there is as part of a school center and church center that happened to have a lot of punk shows there. So they felt that if we're going to get this going, we're going to have to do it. No one else is going to do it for us. The clubs aren't going to be calling us to come play there. So there was that freedom, and that freedom, I think, got a lot of them thinking about the music and their musicianship and why are they in music and why are they playing this kind of music and all that.
Yeah. And in your opinion, when did the DC punk scene start to dwindle out? Like around what time was that, do you think?
I'm not sure there's a dwindling out, but there was certainly a change that happened. And it was a good change in my estimation, that it was more accepted. It was more accepted for a reason. They were getting a little more melodic. A lot of them learned to play better. Things were actually starting to sound really good to a lot of people. And plus, I think this really is a tribute to Ian MacKaye, where he kept pushing this in front of people continually. And they, at some point, you have to realize that, well, let's just take a look at this and see what it is. And you realize it's more than just kids playing guitars and just bashing on them or bashing on drums. You realize there's something more to it. And it changes. And then once that takes hold, the musicians change. And they say, people are looking at us a little more critically. We better get up to snuff here. And so they start changing. And it just goes around in a circle where it gets better and better all the time. And I think it's evolved to a point where right now there is no punk, because punk is sort of spread out into all the different alternative forms of music in the city here, at least in the city here, probably nationwide, although I'm not in contact with the nation.
No, I think you make a great point. I mean, punk is definitely much more accepted by the mainstream. You know, even if it's not fully punk music, there's elements of punk in a lot of pop music, for example, right? So,
absolutely.
So how did your relationship with Fugazi begin?
Well, with Teen Idols.
Oh, they were Teen Idols. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, Ian and Jeff and the rest of the band I knew pretty well, because we recorded a bunch of stuff together. And Ian brought a bunch of bands in to produce. He wanted to produce some bands and mix some bands. And so we recorded just quite a few bands. And you can look through and you can sort of see which ones were there. But, you know, it's probably in the area of more than 100 bands or so. And so we knew our working styles together. And I liked the way he worked. He liked the way I worked. And that's, you know, that really is a good basis for a thing. It's just creatively knowing where you're going and what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it and the way you go and achieve it too. Are you going to really go after the perfect vocal sound, or are you going to go after something better in the performance, or what are you, in other words, what are you looking for? What are you trying to get out of the whole thing? Because you're basically forming a piece of art in a sense, and you want to know what these other people that you're working with, how they're going to go about it and do it, because you want to be on the same page with them. Otherwise, you're working at cross purposes. And it seemed to work out pretty well together. So I worked with Fugazi, and we had, I think, a pretty good relationship as far as getting things done and how things were done. And they, over a long period of time, they evolved. Brendan Canty became, you know, he really got into doing the audio and producing and getting into a lot of aspects of it. And they all grew up a lot, as did I too. I got to know what they wanted out of their songs and went for it more boldly.
So going back for a second to Bad Brains in particular, how did your relationship begin with them?
I believe that Skip Groff and Kim Kane from Sleepy Boys came over to produce their first record. I don't know the exact timeline on it, but then Skip wanted them to do another record, and which was the Black Dots record, and they were getting more rambunctious on stage. Mm-hmm. So he said, "You just do it yourself. I'm going to kind of stay away from it." So we did that, and you know, they're great people. They're very good, creative. Once again, you know, they had something that they looked at and said, "Hey, you know, we could do this. It could be new. It could be in the punk genre, but it could be really new if we play it really fast and really jump around." And at the time, HR was up for doing all the backflips and everything and jumping, and so they had something that they got going in on a style that was new, that appealed to people. They had the energy there, of course. They, you know, since energy was punk in a lot of ways, they just took it up a couple notches and made themselves name for themselves as this band that you just have to watch on stage.
That is so cool. And so I guess then just to wrap things up more or less, Don, is there anything about you individually that you would like people to know about in terms of, your work ethic or what you like to work on?
I consider myself, if I can say this, an artist in a lot of different ways. I record people. I have a recording studio. I play music. But I basically, my training is in painting, so it's all in the visual arts. And I work for the National Gallery of Art for about 10 years. So it's really diverse. I enjoy very much presenting art that people have and helping them to present their art. I'm going to plug my radio show. It was a radio show until the pandemic and everything, but we have a thing called Stagecraft, myself and Alex Videlis. And the idea popped up because stagecraft is one of the things that a lot of musicians, comics, actors, they think about a little bit, but they don't think about it a lot, especially musicians. Musicians have songs, but they don't think about, okay, how am I going to present this to the public where it can have the most impact? And the recording studio helps me to do that because we're taking something that they have and fashioning it so that it's very palatable to a lot of people while not selling out, but still making it so that you could digest it. Because if your eyes and ears can't digest a song or anything an artist puts out, no one's going to see it. Mm-hmm. And if no one sees it, you really aren't making art in a sense. It's likened to a picture. You see a picture on a wall. Well, unless you look at it, and sometimes look at it for a good long time, you aren't going to really get into it and enjoy it. Mm-hmm. So if it's somehow something you just pass over, that kind of looks crappy, then your art isn't going to come across. So you want to have that sense of stagecraft where you can get something across to an audience, across to people. If you're a comedian, you've got to hit home with a lot of the jokes. They've got to understand that. You've got to communicate to people. You've got to really sometimes interact with them, but at the very least, have that communication going on where they feel you're talking to them, you're singing to them, you're acting out a part specifically for them. And that's the most important thing I want to get across. And that's what I want to get across with my art in life. I mean, if I could help people to get this idea across, then I feel that a lot of good ideas not only will get across to people, but I just, that's satisfying to me.